fans of Harry Potter would be forgiven for feeling that there is something hauntingly familiar about Stephen King's It. After all, this is a monstrosity who lives to feed on fear, who dials into its victims' most terrifying phobias and uses them against them to its own ends. It is also a creature whose power is fundamentally tied to perception, so in other words, it is only as powerful as you make it in your own head. That definitely sounds like something from the wizarding world, does it not? And it should too, because it is a boggart. Looking at the evidence, there is just no getting around how closely the demon matches the mythology of J.K. Rowling's most mysterious and ghastly creation. That everything in It Chapter 2 deals with how the Losers Club vanquishes it fits even more with that idea, but don't just take my word for it. Let's take a deep dive into this shape-shifting nightmare. I am the Aura Ash from That Film Theory, and this is how It's Pennywise is actually a boggart. 6. First impressions. First then, we have to consider the rules of a boggart. In Rowling's own words, and I quote, "So the boggart sitting in the darkness within has not yet assumed a form. He does not yet know what will frighten the person on the other side of the door. Nobody knows what a boggart looks like when he is alone, but when I let him out, he will immediately become whatever each of us most fears." The same is fundamentally true of it. Beyond an allusion to the deadlights, the creature's perverse and irresistible draw comes from the fact that it is an unknown. You cannot know its true form because its form is influenced by who sees it. And while both boggarts and it change their shape according to the biggest fear of the person closest, they can appeal to the fears of more than one person, as multiple students at Hogwarts saw Voldemort when confronted with a boggart. In It, the form of Pennywise is chosen predominantly when it is targeting a group because the clown is presented as a communal fear. There is more to it than that though, as we will come to explore. But first, let's start with the simplest similarity. 5. The darkness. In the wizarding world, boggarts are particularly fond of inhabiting dark, confined spaces, such as in wardrobes or under beds or the cupboards under sinks and desks. They seek darkness for comfort. In the same sort of way, Pennywise is presented as a boogeyman who lives underground within dark tunnels and whose stalking of children usually involves enclosed, dark spaces. He's found underneath the bleachers, in a storm drain, in a creepy hall of mirrors, in a library archive. These are all places a boggart would also find comforting. At 2 points in the It doubleheader, he chooses to squeeze into an old fridge. It's not merely for effect, clearly. It's because he fits best there. 4. The shape of fear. Boggarts fundamentally seem to embody the human emotion of fear, and consequently feed on other beings' fears. They draw their power from fear, similar to how a Dementor feeds on human despair and sadness. Boggarts too basically eat this emotion, channeling the most profound fears of its target specifically in order to increase and feed on it. There are rules though. The boggart isn't just a projection of that fear, a disguise as it were. The transformation is more complete than that. The boggart literally becomes whatever scares its victim. So if a person is afraid of a werewolf, the boggart will become a werewolf and will be able to do the same sort of damage, albeit on a slightly lessened scale, as a werewolf. If the fear is fire, the boggart will legitimately be able to burn things. The same goes for it. While the deadlights have their own power in that they drive anyone who sees them insane, there is nothing to say that the lights themselves aren't comprised of communal fear passed down, and that when anyone sees the deadlights, all they're seeing is another form of the boggart. After all, 2 characters in It and It Chapter 2 are caught in the deadlights and are somehow capable of escaping. If they are the most fearsome part of it, they really don't live up to their billing, at least on the screen. It can do the same damage to its victims as the form of fear it inhabits. As well as more broad forms of attack like violence, Aedes leper can pass on infectious diseases, proving there is a similar form of specificity capable in its hauntings. And then there is the point about individual fears again. It appears to each of the losers when they're alone as their most affecting fears, dropping the Pennywise gimmick for all but Richie, who expresses a fear of clowns. In reality, his backstory introduced in Chapter 2 probably means he is scared of bullies and the need for disguises, but Pennywise fits that best anyway. It drives the friends apart because it is more effective when they're separated. That's why it becomes so key that they don't split up, and why it has a greater hold over them than when they are. The reason comes back to the boggart mythology. As wizarding lore confirms, if a boggart appears to multiple victims at once, it can become confused. In the books, Lupin tells a story about a boggart trying to scare 2 people at once with different fears. One was afraid of a headless corpse and another was afraid of flesh-eating slugs. The resulting half a slug that boggart turned into apparently wasn't frightening. That would account for why it prefers the kids apart, because even though it is able to conjure a communal fear, it is not as effective as their own. And as an indication of that, when it loses some of its power at the end of chapter 2, we see it cycling uncontrollably through the individual fears, unable to choose the right one. It might be an incredibly powerful boggart, but once it's had some of that power taken away, it becomes subject to the same limitations. There's another, more specific link that needs to be discussed too, because neither of them can really be killed. 3. Immortality. According to the mythology written by J.K. Rowling on boggarts, they cannot, strictly speaking, die. They can be defeated or vanquished or made to disappear, however you want to say it. But that is no more than their powers being defeated in that moment. They cannot be killed because they're never really alive in the first place. They're not ghosts or ghouls or memories of something living. Their very existence is already formed when they are conceived, and the same can be said of it. We might see Pennywise die at the end of the first chapter, but he simply bounces back 27 years later. Who's to say how many times that has happened over the millions of years of its existence? It's not like defeating it turns out to be anything particularly spectacular. In both cases, It and It Chapter 2, it is just a case of being strong. While it might appear to be gone at the end of the second chapter, its heart torn from Pennywise and crushed, the heart, Pennywise's body, and everything physical about it in that sequence is constructed in the imaginations of the losers. They might stop his power and his hold over them, but they don't kill it. It cannot be killed. He bounces back because those are the terms of his existence. He too was never truly alive in the same way that you or I are. So why should he be able to die? And there are references to books after it was published to it still being around. Who could forget the chilling Pennywise lives graffiti, for instance? So let's talk about how it is defeated once again and why that fits with what we know about boggarts. 2. Ridiculous. As anyone with even a cursory awareness of boggarts knows, the only way to defeat one is to laugh at it, to conjure a counter-image to the projection of fear based on humour. Fundamentally, the victim has to turn that victimhood on the boggart, turning it to a figure of fun and amusement, with laughter out loud acting as its most devastating remedy. The whole transaction is based on the idea of forcing the boggart to assume a less threatening form, to insist that it doesn't actually look like the thing it is trying to use to scare the victim. The same is absolutely true of It, as the finale of Chapter 2 confirms. The ultimate defeat of It isn't simply by strength of will, as the book suggested it was. It is reframed slightly in the films to be about forcing it to take a shape that is less threatening. Because of the quirk that it is limited by the form that it chooses to take, similar to how a boggart takes on the characteristics only of what it transforms into, the losers are able to insist that Pennywise is no more than a ridiculous dancing clown. Nothing more sinister than that. They ridicule Pennywise, taking away his power and effectively laughing at him until he is nothing more than a puddle of goo with a face. They have used their version of ridiculous, using their own imaginations in conjunction with established lore to limit the container the creature takes on. That is so similar to the logic of boggarts that it is almost startling. There is still a question over Pennywise though. While it could be that his form suits the group, so it can appear as a sort of communal phobia, it is a little inelegant, and a little self-serving to theories like this. But there is actually lore in the Wizarding World history that confirms a loophole that could explain Pennywise too. 1. A special boggart ability. So how could the boggart take one form for so long and appear multiple times to lots of different people as Pennywise the dancing clown if it is not just a coincidence that they are all scared of him? Sure, it could be power, as we've already explored, but it could be more specific. In the history of Rowling's books, there was at least one famous boggart that had learned how to take on permanent form. It's not the only example of special boggarts exhibiting strange inflated powers, but the bludgeoning boggart of Old London Town was known to have taken on the form of a murderous thug who prowled the back streets of 19th century London. It wasn't subject to the same restrictions of other boggarts, nor limited to living in the dark waiting for victims. It was free, given a permanent form very much like Pennywise. So why couldn't it be gifted the same power? Perhaps the creature's power is simply higher than that of other boggarts. So it's clear that boggart powers are on a sliding scale depending on their success with victims. Neville Longbottom proves himself particularly susceptible to boggarts because of his traumatic past. But what if he encountered a boggart of tremendous power when he was young? Perhaps his trauma made him open to boggarts, just as the losers seem to be better targets for it because of their traumatic pasts. And he encountered one before he came to Hogwarts. That might explain why he has such a poor memory, just as the losers do when they leave Derry. Fundamentally, it seems there is a lot of evidence to suggest that it is a boggart, and the more you dig into it, the more compelling it gets. So yes, that is how Pennywise could actually be a boggart. What do you think of this theory? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. I've been Ash, and this has been That Film Theory. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you again soon for more hypothetical goodness. Thanks for watching.